Billionaire entered the hospital room, furious, and froze when he saw his ex-wife holding newborn twins. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty wrap every woman in peace that no storm can steal, grace that never fades, and courage that never breaks. May every tear you've cried water the garden of your strength, and every scar become proof of your survival and light. You are the calm after chaos, the song after silence, and the reason love still has a heartbeat. May your days bloom with kindness, your nights rest in safety, and your spirit forever rise in power. My precious family, your voice matters, your love changes lives. A like is a light of hope, a comment is a whisper of strength. This is Mission 1000 likes for every woman who was shattered, stood again, and chose love over bitterness. If your heart still believes like this video, if your soul still fights, comment, "More power to women." The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, while Opal Winter held two miracles she never thought she'd survive long enough to meet. And when the door slammed open with enough force to rattle the medical equipment, she didn't flinch because she'd been expecting Ian Jamison's fury for exactly 3 years. 2 months and 16 days, he filled the doorway like a storm given human form, all sharp angles and expensive fabric and rage that had been aging like poison in a sealed bottle. His attorney flanked his left side, a weasel-faced man clutching papers that probably promised to destroy what little remained of her life. 2 security personnel stood behind him, unnecessary muscle meant to intimidate, and Opal would have laughed if she had the breath for it. The man who had once whispered promises against her skin while rain drummed on skylights now looked at her, like she was something diseased he'd accidentally touched. "You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have you." "Arrested," Ian's voice carried the kind of cold precision that came from boardrooms and courtrooms and places where emotions were weakness. 30 seconds to tell me why you stole from me, disappeared with my children, and thought you could hide behind some pathetic sob story when I finally tracked you down." Opal shifted Jane higher against her chest, feeling the impossibly fragile weight of her daughter, the papery softness of premature skin, the rapid flutter of a heartbeat that sounded like hope struggling to take root. Carly slept in the bassinet beside the bed, smaller than her sister by precious ounces, breathing with the determination of something that refused to surrender despite impossible odds. She'd been doing that same breathing for months now, pulling oxygen into failing lungs, convincing her body to hold on just a little longer, just until they were safe, just until he knew. "You should probably sit down." The words came out rougher than she intended, her throat raw from intubation and screaming and all the crying she'd done when the doctors told her the timeline she was working with. "This is going to take longer than 30 seconds, and you look like you're about to break something expensive. I'm not here for your advice." Ian took 3 steps into the room, and she watched his eyes catalogue everything with the merciless efficiency that had made him so successful, so untouchable, so absolutely certain that his version of reality was the only one that mattered. The grey tint to her skin that no amount of makeup could hide, the IV line snaking into her arm, pumping fluids she could barely process, the medical bracelet that spelled out her diagnosis in terms that required translation for anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with dying. "I'm here to take my children and make sure you never come near them again." "Your children." Opal repeated the words slowly, tasting the bitter comedy of possession from a man who hadn't known they existed until his investigators found her. "That's interesting, considering you spent the last few years telling anyone who would listen that I was a thief and a liar and probably sleeping with half your company for industrial secrets." The attorney stepped forward, his voice carrying the nasal quality of someone who confused legal authority with moral superiority. "Mrs. Winter, my client has evidence of your theft, documentation of your betrayal, and witnesses who will testify to your character. You signed confidentiality agreements that you violated And the courts will absolutely side with a father who can provide stability and resources over a mother who can barely provide basic necessities. Get out! Ian's hand shot up, stopping the attorney mid-breath, and something flickered across his face that Opal recognized from before, from when they'd been different people who believed in different futures. Uncertainty, the first crack in absolute conviction. Everyone get out, now. The attorney sputtered protests about legal counsel and proper procedure, but Ian's security team was already moving toward the door, understanding that tone better than any direct order. Within seconds, the room emptied of everyone except the man she loved and the daughters they'd made, and the truth that was about to detonate between them like a bomb with a very slow fuse. Ian moved closer to the bed, his gaze finally landing on Jane with something that looked almost like wonder fighting against suspicion. She has your eyes, she has your grandmother's chin. Opal adjusted the blanket around Jane's tiny body, protecting her from the air conditioning that the hospital kept brutally cold, from the harshness in her father's voice, from all the things she couldn't shield her from much longer. Carly looks more like you. Same bone structure, same stubborn set to her mouth even when she's sleeping. Your mother would probably hate that. Don't talk about my mother. The words came out sharp enough to cut, and Opal felt the old familiar ache of loving someone who would always choose his family's version of events over any truth she could offer. Why not? She's the one who orchestrated this entire situation. Opal kept her voice level, refusing to give him the emotional reaction he probably expected, the tears and pleading that would confirm everything he'd been told about desperate women and their manipulations. She's the reason I disappeared. She's the reason you believed I betrayed you. She's the reason your daughters spent their first weeks of life in an apartment that barely has heat instead of the home you could have provided. Ian's laugh was harsh and humorless, scraping against the air like metal on stone. Of course, blame my mother. Blame my family. Take no responsibility for your own choices, for the designs that ended up with our competitors, for the photographs that showed you with my brother in circumstances that didn't leave much room for misinterpretation. Photographs can be staged. Opal met his eyes directly, refusing to look away, even though it hurt worse than the cancer eating through her organs, even though she could see he'd already made up his mind, and nothing she said would penetrate that armor of certainty. Evidence can be manufactured. People can lie, especially when they have enough money and motivation to make those lies look like truth. So that's your defense? Some elaborate conspiracy theory where my entire family devoted resources to framing you? Ian leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the picture of dismissive skepticism. You expect me to believe that my mother, who has built her reputation on charity work and cultural preservation, would go to those lengths to destroy some relationship she didn't approve of? Undine, I expect you to watch a video before you make any more decisions about custody or character. Opal reached for the tablet on her bedside table, her hands shaking with effort that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with what she was about to show him. I expect you to see your family for what they actually are, instead of what you've always needed them to be. And then I expect you to leave or stay or do whatever you think is right, because I don't have the energy to convince you of anything anymore. She pulled up the file she'd labeled simply Truth and held the tablet out, watching his face cycle through irritation and reluctance before he finally took it from her. The video was cued to the beginning, to the moment before everything shattered, to the gala where she'd worn that green dress. He'd loved and danced with him like they were the only two. People who mattered in a room full of Manhattan's elite. Just watch it. Her voice cracked on the words, and she hated that betrayal of emotion. That proof that she still cared what he thought despite everything that had been taken from her. Watch it alone if you want. Watch it here if you can handle having your entire worldview demolished in real time. But watch it before you make any decisions about taking my daughters away from the only parent who's been there since conception. Ian stared at the tablet like it might explode, his jaw working with some emotion she couldn't quite read anymore. Some internal battle between the story he'd been living and the possibility that he'd been catastrophically wrong. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the medical equipment and Jane's small sounds and Kaylee's steady breathing from the bassinet. "How long?" His question came out so quietly she almost missed it, and when she looked up, he was staring at her medical bracelet with an expression that might have been horror, or might have been guilt, or might have been some combination she didn't have the capacity to interpret. "How long have you been sick?" "Since the second trimester." Opal felt the weight of those words, the calculation they represented, the choice she'd made that couldn't be unmade. "I could have had treatment that might have saved me, but it would have killed them. So I chose them, and that choice is killing me instead. And I have maybe 6 months, if I'm lucky, to make sure you know how to be their father without me." She watched the information land, watched him process the implications, watched something fundamental shift in his understanding of the situation. He looked at her differently now, not with the fury of a man who believed he'd been wronged, but with the dawning comprehension that maybe, just maybe, he'd been the weapon someone else used to destroy an innocent woman. "Watch the video, Ian." She closed her eyes, exhaustion rolling over her in waves that threatened to pull her under. "Watch it, and then decide whether you still think I'm the villain in this story, or if maybe you need to look a little closer to home to find the real monsters." The door clicked shut behind him as he left. The tablet clutched in his hand like evidence at a crime scene, and Opal finally let herself cry, holding Jane close enough to feel her daughter's heartbeat against her own failing one, knowing that whatever happened next, at least she'd told the truth before running out of time to tell it. Ian sat in his car for 3 hours before he could make himself press play, the tablet resting against the steering wheel like a loaded weapon he wasn't sure he wanted to fire. The parking garage was empty at this hour, just him and the fluorescent lights and the horrible suspicion that his entire understanding of reality was about to collapse like a building with faulty foundations. His hand hovered over the screen, and he thought about Opal's face in that hospital room. The way she'd looked at him with something worse than hatred, with exhaustion so profound it seemed to have weight. The video began at the gala, and he remembered that night with painful clarity. Opal in emerald silk that made her skin glow like polished mahogany, laughing at something his colleague said, her hand warm in his as they moved through crowds of people who all wanted something from him. She'd been nervous about meeting his family officially, about being presented as more than just someone he was seeing casually, and he'd promised her it would be fine, that his mother would see what he saw, that love was enough to bridge any gaps in background or expectation. He'd been spectacularly, devastatingly wrong. The footage was from a security camera he hadn't known existed, angled to capture the private sitting room, adjacent to the main ballroom. His brother appeared first, checking over his shoulder before pulling out his phone and making a call. The audio was tinny but clear enough to make out every word that followed, every calculated syllable of betrayal. She just went to powder her nose. "You have maybe 5 minutes before she comes back through." His brother's voice carried the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans, rather than orchestrating someone's destruction. "The drink is already prepared. Make sure she finishes at least half before you guide her upstairs." Ian's mother entered the frame, elegant in champagne lace, holding 2 wine glasses with the practiced grace of a woman who'd spent decades hosting gatherings where appearances were currency. "You're certain the photographer understands the timing? I don't want any room for her to claim this was manipulated after the fact. He's been paid enough to ensure cooperation and silence." His brother accepted one of the glasses, examining it like he was checking for poison rather than adding it. "The photos will show clear consciousness, clear willingness. By the time Ian sees them, there won't be any question about what she chose to do." Ian's hand tightened on the tablet, hard enough that the screen protector cracked. a spiderweb of fractures spreading across the image of his family, casually discussing, drugging the woman he loved. He wanted to stop watching, wanted to pretend he'd never seen this, wanted to go back to the comfortable ignorance where his family's judgment was wisdom rather than cruelty. But Opal's words echoed in his skull, and he kept watching. The video jumped forward, showing Opal returning from the bathroom, her smile easy and unguarded, in a way she never looked around people she didn't trust. His mother approached with the warmth of a practiced hostess, offering the wine with words the audio couldn't quite capture, but that clearly made Opal laugh, made her accept the glass, made her take 3 long sips before setting it down to continue their conversation. 15 minutes later, Opal's body language changed. She swayed slightly, caught herself against a chair, pressed her fingers to her temple like she was trying to hold her skull together through force of will, alone. His brother materialized at her elbow, all false concern and helpful guidance, steering her toward the stairs with a hand that looked supportive, but gripped her arm hard enough to leave marks Ian could see, even through the grainy footage. The bedroom scene was exactly as staged as Opal had claimed, his brother positioning her unconscious body on the bed, arranging her dress to suggest intimacy rather than assault, the photographer moving around them like he was documenting art rather than manufacturing evidence. Ian watched his brother lean down to whisper something in Opal's ear, watched him adjust her hair across the pillow, watched him create a tableau of betrayal so convincing that Ian had believed it without question when the photos landed on his desk 3 days later. The video continued, showing his mother and brother in his father's study, rehearsing the confrontation they would perform. His mother practiced her tearful disappointment, her maternal concern, her reluctant revelation that she'd discovered something terrible. His brother worked on his shame-faced confession, admitting to a moment of weakness with a woman who'd pursued him relentlessly, who'd made advances he should have reported but hadn't because he was trying to protect Ian from embarrassment. They refined the story like scriptwriters preparing for opening night, adjusting details, anticipating questions, building a narrative so airtight that Ian would have no choice but to believe it. And the final segment showed them planting the stolen designs in Opal's apartment, his mother using a key Ian had given her for emergencies, his brother photographing each document in its new location, creating a trail of evidence that would destroy any credibility Opal might try to maintain. The video ended with his mother's face filling the screen, speaking directly to his brother with satisfaction that looked almost sexual in its intensity. Some women need to be erased, not dismissed. Ian will thank me eventually when he marries someone who understands what our family name actually means. This girl was never going to be anything but an embarrassment, and better to cut out the infection before it spreads. Ishan vomited into the parking garage, his body rejecting the truth more violently than his mind could process it. He heaved until there was nothing left, until his throat burned and his eyes watered and his hands shook against the concrete. The tablet lay beside him, screen still glowing with the frozen image of his mother's triumphant expression. And he wanted to smash it, wanted to destroy the evidence, wanted to unhear everything he'd just witnessed. But he couldn't. And more terrifyingly, he knew this was just the beginning of understanding how thoroughly he'd failed the woman carrying his children. He drove to Opal's apartment on instinct, not sure what he'd say, not sure if she'd even let him in, but needing to see her face while he tried to comprehend the magnitude of what his family had done. The building was old but maintained, the kind of place where people actually knew their neighbors, where community mattered more than square footage. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, and he took the stairs because he needed the time to figure out what words could possibly bridge the gap between ignorance and accountability. She answered the door before he could knock, like she'd been waiting, like she'd known he'd come back once he understood. Jane was crying in her arms, that particular newborn wail that sounded like the world ending in slow motion, and Opal looked more exhausted than any human should be capable of looking while still technically alive. Come in or don't. But decide quickly, because she needs to eat, and I need to sit down before I fall down." Opal turned back into the apartment, leaving the door open, leaving the choice to him. Ian followed her inside, closing the door gently behind him, taking in the cramped space that somehow felt more like a home than his penthouse ever had. Baby equipment covered every surface, bottles drying on a rack by the sink, tiny clothes folded on the coffee table, the organized chaos of someone doing everything alone because they had no other option. Opal settled into a worn armchair, adjusting Jane with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this without help, without support, without any of the resources she should have had access to. She didn't look at him, just focused on her daughter, and the intimacy of watching her nurse made Ian feel like he was witnessing something sacred he had no right to observe. "I watched it." The words came out hoarse, inadequate, too small for the destruction they referenced. "I watched all of it, every second, every lie they told, every choice they made to destroy you." "Good." Opal's voice was flat, drained of any emotion that might have made this conversation easier. "Then you know I didn't betray you. I didn't steal from you. I didn't sleep with your brother or sell secrets or do any of the things you believed I did. Your family destroyed me because your mother decided I wasn't good enough to carry the Jameson name, and you let her do it because trusting them was easier than trusting me." The accusation landed like a physical blow, and Ian couldn't even argue because she was absolutely right. He'd chosen his family's word over hers without hesitation, had accepted their version of events because it confirmed suspicions. He hadn't even known he was carrying about whether someone from her background could really fit into his world. "I'm sorry." The apology felt pathetically insufficient, like offering a band-aid for a severed limb. "I'm so fucking sorry, Opal. I should have questioned everything. I should have demanded proof. I should have trusted you instead of them." "Your apologies don't change anything." She finally looked at him, and her eyes carried a flatness that was worse than anger, worse than hatred, the emotional equivalent of scorched earth. "They don't give me back the pregnancy I spent terrified and alone. They don't erase the months I lived in my car because no one would hire me with the criminal record your mother manufactured. They don't cure the cancer that's killing me because I chose to save your daughters instead of myself." Ian's knees gave out, and he found himself on the floor beside her chair, his carefully constructed world crumbling into pieces too small to ever fit back together. "Tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix this. Tell me anything except that I'm too late to matter." "You are too late." Opal adjusted Jane, who'd fallen asleep mid-feeding, her tiny face peaceful in a way that made Ian's chest ache. "You're too late to save our relationship, too late to be here for the pregnancy, too late to stop your family from almost killing me. But you're not too late to be their father, and that's the only thing I care about anymore." She stood with more effort than should be required for such a simple movement, carrying Jane to the bassinet where Kaylee slept, placing both daughters side by side like precious cargo that might shatter if handled roughly. When she turned back to Ian, her expression carried something he couldn't quite identify, some mixture of grief and determination and resignation. "You have 6 months to learn everything I know about keeping them alive, and then you're on your own." She moved toward her bedroom, each step deliberate, like she was counting the energy expenditure of existing. "You can sleep on the couch if you want. You can leave and come back tomorrow. You can do whatever you need to do to process what you just learned. But if you stay, you're getting up for the feeding in 3 hours. And I'm going to teach you how to be the father they deserve, even if you'll never be the man I needed you to be." The bedroom door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded like a coffin lid, and Ian sat alone in the living room, with his daughters sleeping nearby, and the weight of his family's sins pressing down on him like gravity had suddenly intensified. He pulled out his phone, staring at his mother's contact information, at his brother's name, at the family group chat that was probably full of questions about where he'd been. He deleted every contact, blocked every number, and settled onto the couch that was too short for his frame, making a silent promise to the two tiny humans who breathed in, synchronized, rhythm that he would spend whatever time remained learning to be worthy of the sacrifice their mother had made to bring them into a world that had tried so hard to erase her from it. Chapter 3. The Price of Silence. Dawn came too early and brought Kaylee's cries with it, piercing through the thin walls of the apartment like an alarm designed specifically to trigger every protective instinct Ian didn't know he possessed. He jerked awake on the couch, disoriented, his back screaming from the impossible angles he'd twisted himself into during the night. The crying continued, escalating from whimpers to full-throated wails that sounded like someone had mortally wounded something incredibly small and furious. Opal appeared in the bedroom doorway, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been slept in for days, her head wrapped in a silk scarf that couldn't quite hide how much hair she'd lost. She watched him with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating whether he'd run or stay, whether he was the type to step up or the type to write checks and disappear behind the buffer money could provide. She needs to be changed and fed in that order, or she'll scream through the entire bottle and give herself gas that'll keep her miserable for hours. Opal's voice carried no sympathy for his obvious discomfort, no gentle introduction to fatherhood, just facts delivered like survival instructions in a language he was supposed to already speak fluently. Diapers are under the changing table, wipes are in the warmer, and if you get powder on her instead of ointment first, you'll make the rash worse instead of better. Ian approached the bassinet like it contained a bomb with complicated diffusing instructions, his hands hovering uncertainly over Kaylee's tiny body. She was so impossibly small, all wrinkled skin and spindly limbs, and rage disproportionate to her size. He'd negotiated million-dollar contracts, had faced down hostile boards and bitter competitors, but nothing had prepared him for the terror of lifting something this fragile, this dependent, this absolutely convinced that he was going to fail her, support her head, always support her head. Opal moved beside him, her hands guiding his with the patience of someone teaching emergency procedures to a child. Premature babies have weaker neck muscles, and Kaylee's are especially underdeveloped. You need to be her skeleton until she grows strong enough to support herself. He lifted his daughter with the kind of care reserved for handling antiquities, feeling her weight settle into his arms like an accusation and a benediction simultaneously. She stopped crying the moment he held her against his chest, her tiny fist finding his finger with the instinctive grip that evolution had programmed into humans before language existed. Something fundamental shifted in his understanding of responsibility, in his definition of what mattered, in his entire framework for measuring worth. The diaper change was a disaster of the exact type Opal had predicted, with powder going everywhere except where it should, wipes being used inefficiently, and Carly voicing her extreme displeasure with the amateur production. But he got her clean and changed without dropping her or causing actual harm, which apparently qualified as success in the brutal mathematics of infant care. Now the bottle. Pre-made formula is in the fridge, needs to be warmed in the bottle warmer for exactly 4 minutes. Test it on your wrist to make sure it's not too hot, and when you feed her, keep her elevated at a 45-degree angle, or she'll aspirate. Opal rattled off instructions while simultaneously preparing Jane's bottle, moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd been doing this alone for weeks. She'll eat about 2 ounces and then need to be burped. Another ounce and burped again, and if she starts making clicking sounds, the nipple flow is too fast and you need to give her a break. Ian followed the instructions with the concentration of someone diffusing actual explosives, testing the temperature multiple times because he couldn't trust his own judgment about what constituted safe warmth for a baby's mouth. Carly latched onto the bottle with desperate hunger, her eyes rolling back slightly with the satisfaction of need being met. And Ian felt absurdly proud of accomplishing this basic task that millions of people manage daily without thinking twice. "Tell me about the pregnancy." The words came out before he could stop them, before he could consider whether Opal wanted to share that history or if dragging her through those memories was just another form of cruelty. "Tell me what happened after you left. After my family destroyed you, after I failed you completely." Opal settled into the armchair with Jane, her movements careful in a way that suggested pain she wasn't acknowledging. "You don't want to know. You want to feel like you understand, but actually hearing it will just make you feel worse. And my capacity for managing your guilt is currently sitting at 0. Tell me anyway." Ian adjusted Kaylee against his arm, following Opal's earlier instructions about angle and elevation, trying to do at least one thing right in a situation where he'd gotten everything catastrophically wrong. "I don't get to not know just because knowing is uncomfortable. That's how I ended up here in the first place, choosing comfort over truth." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the twins feeding, the rhythmic pull of nourishment that somehow felt like the only honest thing happening in the room. Finally, Opal began speaking in a voice that sounded like she was reading from a script she'd memorized, but wished she could forget. "I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after you threw me out of your life. 6 weeks of sleeping in my car because landlords wouldn't rent to someone with a suddenly terrible credit score and a criminal record that appeared overnight. 6 weeks of rationing food because the money I'd saved disappeared from my accounts through some legal mechanism I still don't fully understand. 6 weeks of applying for jobs that all mysteriously fell through after the background check, after someone made phone calls to ensure I'd never work in my field again." She paused to burp Jane, the practiced pat-pat-pat against her daughter's back, providing percussion to her devastating narrative. "I took a pregnancy test in a gas station bathroom at 2 in the morning because that's when the nausea got bad enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Positive. Undeniably, impossibly positive, and my first thought wasn't joy or fear. It was the calculation of how fast I needed to find stable housing before my body started showing." Ian felt Kaylee go still in his arms, her feeding done, her small body heavy with the contentment of a full stomach. He lifted her to his shoulder, mimicking Opal's burping position, feeling ridiculously out of his depth with every aspect of this new reality. "I called Indigo, my sister, the only family member I have who actually answers the phone. She sent money, enough for a deposit on this apartment, enough for a few months of breathing room while I figured out how to survive. I got a job cleaning offices at night under the table, paying just enough to keep me from being completely destitute. And I didn't tell you because your mother made it very clear that if I ever contacted you again, she'd ensure that Child Protective Services would be waiting at the hospital the moment I gave birth." The casual delivery of that threat made Ian's blood run cold. "She said that explicitly? She threatened to take your children. She sent it in a text message from a burner phone, untraceable, unprovable, but crystal clear about the consequences of me disrupting your life further." Opal's laugh was bitter enough to strip paint. She included examples of cases where newborns had been removed from mothers deemed unfit, where women with criminal records and unstable housing lost custody before they even got to try. She knew exactly which pressure points would keep me silent. Ian's arms tightened around Kaylee protectively, and the irony wasn't lost on him that he was holding one of the children his mother had threatened to steal, using legal systems designed to protect vulnerable infants as weapons to terrorize a woman who'd done nothing wrong. "When did you find out about the cancer?" "Second trimester. I was tired all the time, losing weight instead of gaining it, having trouble breathing that I assumed was just pregnancy stuff. But then I started bleeding, and the emergency room doctor ordered scans that showed masses in places masses should never be." Her voice remained steady, clinical, like she was describing someone else's tragedy rather than her own death sentence. They offered me treatment that might have worked if I acted immediately. Aggressive chemotherapy, surgery, radiation. The whole arsenal of modern medicine thrown at cells that were trying to kill me. She adjusted Jane in her arms, and Ian noticed how much effort that small movement required, how her hands trembled with exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. But all of that would have killed them, would have ended the pregnancy, would have made me choose between my life and theirs, and I didn't even have to think about it. I'd already lost everything else, my career, my reputation, the man I loved, any future I'd imagined for myself. But I could give them life, could make sure that something good came from all the destruction your family caused. So you chose to die. Ian's voice cracked on the words, and Kaylee stirred against his shoulder, responding to the distress in his tone. You chose to sacrifice yourself for children whose father believed you were a criminal, for babies you didn't even know would survive, for a future you won't get to see. I chose them over me, which is what mothers do when the alternative is unthinkable. Opal met his eyes directly, and the force of her conviction was almost physical. I chose to spend whatever time I have left making sure they know they were wanted, that they were worth saving, that their existence isn't a tragedy, but a triumph over people who tried to erase me completely. Jane started fussing, and Opal stood with visible effort, carrying her to the changing table for the same routine Ian had just fumbled through with Kaylee. He watched her move through the motions with practiced efficiency, saw how much pain each movement cost her, understood with devastating clarity that she was operating on borrowed time that was running out faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. What can I do? The question felt inadequate, too broad, unable to capture the specific ways he wanted to fix things that were fundamentally unfixable. What do you need from me besides just learning how to keep them alive? Opal finished changing Jane and turned to face him, holding their daughter against her chest in a way that looked like she was memorizing the weight, the warmth, the reality of something she wouldn't have much longer. I need you to understand that your family didn't just hurt me. They killed me. Maybe not directly, maybe not with their own hands, but the stress, the homelessness, the delayed prenatal care, the choice I had to make about treatment, all of that traces back to decisions they made because they thought I wasn't good enough for their precious son. The accusation hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, and Ian couldn't dispute it because she was absolutely right. His family had set in motion a chain of events that ended with the woman he'd loved dying before she reached her 30th birthday, and he'd been complicit through his willingness to believe their lies without demanding proof. I'm going to destroy them. The promise came out like a vow, like a binding contract signed in blood. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what they did, make sure they lose everything they value. Make sure the Jameson name becomes synonymous with the kind of cruelty that destroys innocent women. Your revenge won't keep me alive. Opal's words cut through his fury with the precision of a scalpel. It won't give your daughters their mother back. It won't undo any of the damage that's already been done. And honestly, I don't care what you do to your family as long as it doesn't distract you from the only thing that actually matters, which is learning how to be the parent these girls need when I'm gone. She moved back to the bedroom. Exhaustion pulling her down like gravity had intensified, like the weight of staying upright required more energy than she had available. There's a binder on the kitchen counter with feeding schedules, sleep patterns, medical information, pediatrician contacts, everything you need to know about keeping them healthy and safe. Study it like your life depends on it, because their lives absolutely do. The door closed behind her, and Ian was left alone with his daughters, both sleeping now in their bassinets, their tiny chests rising and falling with the determined breath of organisms that refused to surrender, despite being born too early into circumstances that should have broken them. He pulled out his phone, staring at the deleted contacts. At the family he'd excised from his life hours earlier, and felt rage settle into his bones like ice crystallizing into patterns that would never fully thaw. But Opal was right. Revenge could wait. Right now, he had 2 daughters who needed him to learn how to be their father, and approximately 6 months to become the man he should have been all along, before the woman who'd sacrificed everything for them ran out of time to teach him how. Chapter 4. The Family Fortress. Ian's father arrived first, knocking on Opal's apartment door with the tentative uncertainty of someone who knew they weren't welcome, but hoped for mercy anyway. It was early afternoon, and Ian had been up for 36 hours straight, learning the brutal rhythms of newborn care, the way time became meaningless when measured in feeding intervals, and diaper changes and the specific cries that meant hunger versus pain versus exhaustion, versus the general rage of being small and powerless. Your mother is beside herself. His father's opening words were so spectacularly tone-deaf that Ian actually laughed, a sound with no humor in it, just the acknowledgement that even now, even after everything, his family's first instinct was to center their own suffering. She's worried about you, about what this woman has told you, about how you're being manipulated during a vulnerable moment. Get out! Ian blocked the doorway with his body, aware of Opal sleeping in the next room, aware that she needed rest, more than she needed to witness another confrontation with people who'd tried to destroy her. You don't get to come here. You don't get to pretend concern. You don't get access to anything in my life anymore. His father's face cycled through surprise and indignation before settling into something that might have been actual distress if Ian still trusted his ability to read this man's emotions accurately. I'm your father. I've known you since you took your first breath, raised you, provided for you, built a legacy that you're throwing away because some woman showed you a video that could easily be fabricated. The video isn't fabricated. Ian kept his voice low, conscious of Kaylee sleeping in her bassinet just inside the door, conscious that even this conversation was an intrusion into space that should be protected. I had it analyzed by 3 independent experts who all confirmed it hasn't been edited or manipulated in any way. What I watched was real. What your wife did to Opal was real. And your silence while it happened makes you just as guilty as if you drugged her yourself. The accusation landed like a physical blow, and Ian watched his father age 10 years in the span of seconds, his face collapsing into lines that spoke of choices he'd avoided examining too closely. I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea what your mother was planning, what she'd done. You have to believe me. I don't have to believe anything you say ever again. Ian felt his jaw tighten, felt the exhaustion of sleepless nights and shattered worldviews pressing down on him like atmospheric pressure. But even if you're telling the truth, even if you really didn't know beforehand, you know now. You've known since I showed you the evidence last week. And you're still here, still defending her, still trying to smooth things over, like this is some minor family disagreement instead of attempted murder by proxy. His father's hand gripped the doorframe like he needed the support to remain upright. That's an extreme characterization. Your mother made mistakes, yes, but calling it attempted murder is inflammatory and unhelpful to finding resolution. Opal is dying because of decisions your wife made. Ian enunciated each word clearly, making sure there was no possible misunderstanding. She's dying because the stress your wife caused triggered complications that led to delayed diagnosis, that led to a choice between saving herself or saving my daughters, that led to her choosing them and accepting her own death sentence. So no, calling it attempted murder isn't extreme. If anything, it's generous. The sound of multiple vehicles parking outside filtered through the thin walls, and Ian's stomach dropped because he recognized the particular rumble of his mother's preferred town car, the expensive purr of engines that cost more than most people earned annually. The invasion he'd been dreading was beginning, and he was about to have to defend Opal's home from the same people who'd tried to erase her existence entirely. His mother swept into the building's lobby with the imperious energy of someone accustomed to doors opening automatically. His brother trailing behind her with the hangdog expression of someone who'd been coached on appropriate remorse but hadn't quite mastered the execution. Two people Ian vaguely recognized as family attorneys brought up the rear, carrying briefcases that probably contained threats disguised as legal documents. "Ian, sweetheart, you look terrible." His mother's opening gambit was concern wrapped in criticism, the particular combination she'd perfected over decades of managing family image over family reality. "This woman clearly isn't capable of providing proper care, and you're sacrificing your health trying to compensate for her inadequacies. Let us help you. Let us bring in proper staff who can ensure the babies receive appropriate attention. Don't call them the babies like they're abstract concepts." Ian descended the apartment stairs to meet his family in the lobby, putting his body between them and the door that protected his daughters. "They're Jane and Kaylee. They have names, and you don't get to pretend interest now when you spent the last 3 years trying to ensure they'd never exist." His mother's face went through several complicated expressions before settling on injured dignity, the performance she always defaulted to when confronted with her own cruelty. "I don't know what lies that woman has filled your head with, but I've only ever wanted what's best for you. If I seemed harsh in my judgment of your previous relationship, it was because I could see things you couldn't. Warning signs that indicated she wasn't trustworthy. You drugged her." Ian let the words drop into the space between them like grenades. "You conspired with my brother to create evidence of betrayal that never happened. You manufactured a criminal record to ensure she couldn't work. You threatened to have her children taken away if she ever contacted me again. Those aren't the actions of a concerned mother. They're the actions of someone who values control more than human life." His brother finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and uncertain. "Ian, if you'd just let me explain, if you'd hear my side of what happened that night, you'd understand that things aren't as black and white as she's making them seem." "Your side?" Ian turned to face the brother he'd once trusted completely, the person he'd grown up with, played with, built childhood forts with, shared secrets with. "You drugged an unconscious woman and staged photographs to destroy her reputation. What possible context makes that defensible? What explanation could you offer that would make me see you as anything other than a predator who targeted someone I loved because your mother told you to?" The color drained from his brother's face, and for the first time, Ian saw something that might have been actual shame flickering beneath the practiced excuses. "I thought I was protecting you from making a terrible mistake. I thought she was using you to access wealth and status, that she'd leave eventually anyway and take half of everything you'd built. Mother convinced me that intervening early would save you from worse pain later. So you committed what amounts to assault because you decided she wasn't good enough for me." Ian's voice rose despite his efforts to keep it controlled, loud enough that he saw apartment doors crack open above them. Neighbors listening to the Jameson family dirty laundry being aired in a building where privacy was usually respected. "You destroyed an innocent woman's life because you and Mother had already written the story of who she was, without bothering to check whether your assumptions had any basis in reality." His mother stepped forward, her hand reaching for Ian's arm, in a gesture that probably looked comforting to observers, but felt like a shackle to him. "Everything I did because I love you. Because I've seen too many young men derailed by women who recognize opportunity when they see it. Because your grandfather built this family's reputation over 70 years, and I won't watch it crumble because you confused lust with love." Ian jerked away from her touch, like it burned. "Opal is dying. She's 28 years old, brilliant, kind, more talented than half the people working in my firm, and she's dying because you decided she wasn't worthy of basic human decency. She's dying because I believed you instead of her, and you're standing here trying to justify it, trying to make it sound like protection instead of what it actually was, which is calculated destruction of someone whose only crime was loving me, while being insufficiently connected. The lobby fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. Ian's father stood frozen on the stairs, his face carrying the expression of someone watching a building collapse in slow motion. His mother's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way color flooded and then drained from her face as she processed that her son wasn't going to forgive this, wasn't going to let it slide, wasn't going to prioritize family unity over accountability. "What do you want from me?" His mother's voice cracked on the question, and Ian might have felt sympathy if he had any capacity left for emotions that didn't involve rage and grief. "What possible action could I take that would satisfy you?" "I can't undo the past. I can't make her healthy again. I can't give you back the relationship you're mourning. So what exactly do you expect me to do?" "I expect you to stay away from my daughters." Ian spoke with the finality of someone handing down a sentence from which there would be no appeal. "I expect you to never contact me again, to never attend their birthdays or graduations or weddings, to never act as though you have any right to participate in their lives. I expect you to lose your position on every board, every committee, every charitable organization that gives you access to vulnerable people you might harm. I expect you to discover what it feels like to be erased from someone's existence, to be treated like you don't matter, to lose everything you thought made you important." His mother's face went chalk white, and she gripped her purse like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. "You can't be serious? You're talking about destroying your own family over someone you barely knew for a few months. This is temporary insanity, grief-talking, and when you calm down and think rationally, you'll realize you're making a terrible mistake." The terrible mistake was believing you in the first place. Ian turned his back on them all, climbing the stairs toward the apartment where his daughters slept, and their mother fought to stay alive long enough to teach him how to function without her. "Consider this the last conversation we'll ever have where I'm civil. If I see any of you near this building again, near Opal's family, near anyone connected to my daughters, I'll make sure the video of what you did goes viral. I'll make sure every news outlet, every social media platform, every person who's ever respected the Jameson name knows exactly what kind of monsters wear expensive clothes and philanthropic masks." He heard his mother make a sound like she'd been wounded, heard his brother start to say something that probably would have been another excuse, heard his father's heavy breathing as he struggled with emotions he'd spent a lifetime suppressing. But Ian kept walking, kept climbing, kept moving toward the door that protected the only family that mattered anymore, leaving behind the people who'd taught him that appearances were everything and truth was negotiable. Opal stood in the apartment doorway, holding Jane against her chest, her face carrying the exhausted triumph of someone who'd heard everything and was grateful they didn't have to fight this particular battle themselves. "Well, that went better than I expected. I thought your mother might try to physically force her way until she's calculating whether the social cost of a scene is worth the satisfaction of asserting dominance." Ian closed and locked the door behind him, engaging both deadbolts and the chain he'd installed the day before. Give her a few hours, and she'll start making phone calls to lawyers and image consultants, trying to figure out how to spin this in her favor. Let her try. Opal moved back to the living room, settling into the armchair that had become her command center for managing 2 newborns, while her body systematically shut down. "I've got copies of that video stored in 7 different locations, all with instructions to release it publicly if anything happens to me, to you, or to the girls. Your mother's power only extends as far as her reputation allows, and I'm holding enough evidence to destroy that reputation completely." Ian looked at her with something approaching awe, understanding that even while dying, even while using every ounce of energy just to stay conscious, Opal had been preparing for war against people who'd underestimated her capacity for strategic thinking. "You've been planning this since you found out you were pregnant." "Since I found out I was dying," she corrected him gently, stroking Jane's back with movements that were becoming more automatic than conscious. "I knew I wouldn't be here to protect them from your family's toxic need for control, so I made sure I had ammunition that would keep them at a distance even after I'm gone. Your mother stays away, or everyone learns exactly what she's capable of. Those are her only options." Kylie woke crying, and Ian moved automatically to pick her up, his body already adapting to the rhythms of infant care, even though his mind still struggled to process how completely his life had transformed in less than a week. He held his daughter against his chest, feeling her settle as she recognized his heartbeat, his warmth, his particular scent that already meant safety to her developing brain. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate but necessary, acknowledgement of debts that could never actually be repaid. "Thank you for protecting them, even when I failed you completely. Thank you for being strong enough to fight my family when I was too blind to see they needed fighting. Thank you for choosing them over treatment that might have saved you." Opal's eyes glistened with tears she wouldn't let fall, and her voice came out rougher than usual. "Don't thank me for loving my daughters. Don't make me into some kind of martyr because I made the only choice I could live with. They're mine, and protecting them was never optional. It was just what mothers do when the world tries to harm what they've created." She stood slowly, carrying Jane toward the bedroom, each step measured and careful, like she was counting how many movements she had left before her body gave out completely. "Get some sleep while they're both quiet. You've been up for too long, and exhaustion makes you stupid. And they need you to be smart enough to keep them alive when I can't anymore." The bedroom door closed, and Ian was left alone with Kaylee, with the apartment that had become his entire world, with the understanding that he had maybe 6 months to become the father these girls deserved, while the woman who'd already given them everything slowly disappeared into the death his family had helped orchestrate. Chapter 5. The vigil. The call came at 3 in the morning, 3 weeks after Ian had moved into Opal's tiny apartment and learned that loving someone meant watching them deteriorate without being able to stop it. Indigo's voice came through his phone, sharp with panic and exhaustion, explaining that Opal had collapsed in the bathroom, that the ambulance was already on its way, that he needed to get to the hospital immediately and bring whatever medical directives Opal had prepared, because this wasn't a temporary setback. This was the beginning of the end. Ian woke the neighbor who'd agreed to emergency childcare, a grandmother named Ruth, who'd been showing him tricks for soothing colicky babies and never asked questions about why he looked like death warmed over most mornings. He handed over both twins with instructions that trembled out of him faster than conscious thought, grabbed the folder containing Opal's advance directives, and drove to the hospital with his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. The emergency room was the particular hell of fluorescent lighting and disinfectant smell, and people waiting to find out whether someone they loved would survive the night. Indigo sat in the waiting area with her arms wrapped around herself, her face carrying the particular devastation of someone who'd been preparing for this moment, but still wasn't ready when it arrived. "She's stable for now, but they're saying her organs are starting to fail." Indigo's voice was steady, despite the tears streaming down her face, the practiced composure of someone who'd been the strong one in her family long before this crisis. "Kidneys are barely functioning, liver enzymes are elevated. They're talking about comfort measures and palliative care, and whether she wants to be intubated if her breathing gets worse." Ian felt his knees go weak, felt the hospital floor tilt beneath him like he was on a ship in rough seas. "Can I see her?" "They're moving her to a private room. She asked for you specifically, made me promise to call you first before anyone else in the family." Indigo stood, and Ian noticed for the first time how much she resembled Opal, the same bone structure and determined set to her jaw, the genetic blueprint that connected them across distance and different life trajectories. She also asked me to make sure you understand something before you go in there. What? That the twins come first. That if medical decisions need to be made, if resources are limited, if there's any question about priorities, the answer is always them. Indigo's voice carried the weight of a message she'd been entrusted to deliver exactly right. She doesn't want you trying to save her at their expense. She's made her peace with dying, and she needs you to make yours so you can focus on what actually matters. The words landed like body blows, and Ian wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he could save everyone, wanted to reject the binary choice between Opal's life and his daughter's future. But he'd spent 3 weeks learning that wanting things didn't make them possible, that love wasn't enough to stop cancer or reverse time or undo the cascading consequences of choices made when he'd trusted the wrong people. They let him into her room 20 minutes later, and the sight of her hooked up to machines that beeped and hissed and monitored her body's systematic failure made something crack in his chest that he wasn't sure would ever properly heal. She looked smaller than she had that morning, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the life force draining out of her in increments too small to track until they added up to absence. "Hey," her voice came out raspy, damaged from whatever had happened in those moments between collapse and ambulance arrival. "You look worse than I do, which is honestly impressive considering I'm actively dying." Ian tried to laugh and produce something closer to a sob, pulling a chair to her bedside and taking her hand with the gentleness reserved for holding things that might shatter. "The girls are with Ruth. She's got enough formula for the night, knows all their schedules, has my number on speed dial if anything goes wrong." "Good, that's good." Opal's eyes drifted closed briefly, conserving energy even for this conversation, rationing the strength required to stay conscious. "I need to tell you things while I still can. Things about them, about me, about how to navigate everything after I'm gone. Can you listen without trying to argue or make promises about me getting better?" "I can try." It was the most honest answer he could offer, acknowledging his limitations while committing to doing his best with what capacity he had available. Opal's fingers tightened weakly around his, and she opened her eyes to look at him directly. "Jane is going to be your easy one, the one who adapts, who smiles to make people comfortable, who learns early that being pleasant gets her what she needs. Don't let that fool you into thinking she doesn't need you as much as Kaylee does. Pay attention when she's quiet, when she's withdrawn, when she's performing happiness instead of feeling it." Ian nodded, committing every word to memory like his daughter's futures depended on perfect recall, which they probably did. Kylie is going to fight everything. Sleep, food, comfort, eventually rules and expectations, and anything that feels like control. Opal's smile was fond despite the topic, recognizing herself in descriptions of a baby too young to have developed real personality yet. "She's going to exhaust you, but don't try to break her spirit just because it would be easier. She's fierce for a reason, and that fierceness is going to protect her from people who want to diminish her." The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, marking time in heartbeats and breaths, and the slow countdown to an ending nobody wanted but couldn't prevent. Ian wanted to tell her to save her strength, to rest, to stop trying to fit entire lifetimes of parenting advice into whatever hours remained. But he also understood that this was how she was choosing to spend her last coherent moments, and stopping her would be stealing something precious. "I wrote letters." Her voice was getting weaker, words requiring more effort to shape and push out into the world. "Hundreds of them. They're in a locked box under my bed, organized by occasion and age. First day of school, first heartbreak, graduation, wedding day, the birth of their own children, if they choose to have them. Everything I wish I could be there to say in person, written down so they'll have my voice, even when they can't have my presence." Tears Ian had been holding back for weeks finally broke through his careful control. sliding down his face without sound, without the dramatic sobbing that would have made this moment about his grief instead of her final instructions. I don't know how to do this without you. I don't know how to be enough for them when I'm still learning how to be anything resembling adequate. You'll figure it out the same way every parent does, by making mistakes and fixing them and loving them fiercely enough that the mistakes don't define everything. Opal's breathing was getting shallower, her chest moving with effort that looked painful to witness. You'll probably mess up big things and small things, and they'll be angry at you sometimes, and you'll doubt yourself constantly. That's normal. That's just parenting without a manual that works for your specific situation. A nurse entered quietly, checking the machines, adjusting medication through the IV line, her face carefully neutral, in the way medical professionals learn to maintain when bearing witness to tragedy they couldn't prevent. She made notes on a tablet and left without interrupting, granting them privacy for whatever time remained. There's something else. Opal's voice dropped lower, forcing Ian to lean closer to hear her. Something about your family that you need to understand before I'm gone and can't explain it anymore. Ian tensed, not sure he could handle more revelations about the depth of his family's capacity for harm. Your mother isn't going to stop. The words carried certainty that came from experience with people who valued control over everything else. She's going to wait until I'm dead, until grief makes you vulnerable, and then she's going to try to manipulate her way back into your life through the girls. She'll show up at events, send gifts, manufacture situations where refusing her access makes you look unreasonable. I won't let that happen. The promise came out fierce, protective, the particular rage of someone who'd learned too late what his family was capable of inflicting. You might not have a choice if she's strategic enough. Opal's eyes held his with intensity that belied her physical deterioration. So I need you to remember something, really remember it in your bones, so it guides you when she's spinning stories that sound reasonable. She's not a grandmother trying to connect with her grandchildren. She's the woman who killed their mother. Those two facts can't coexist in the same space. Choose the truth over the comfortable lie, even when choosing truth is harder. The machines started beeping more urgently, and nurses flooded into the room with practiced efficiency, adjusting equipment and calling for doctors and asking Ian to step back. Please, sir, give us room to work. He found himself pressed against the wall, watching them try to stabilize her, watching Opal's face go slack as consciousness slipped away from her, watching the numbers on monitors drop and spike and paint pictures of systems failing despite everyone's best efforts. Indigo appeared beside him, her hand finding his arm, anchoring him when he felt like he might fly apart into pieces too small to ever reassemble. They're going to move her to ICU. We should call the rest of the family. Let everyone know it's time to come say goodbye if they want to. The waiting room gradually filled with Opal's extended family. Cousins Ian had never met, and aunts who looked at him with complicated expressions that mixed grief with judgment. They knew who he was, knew he was connected to the family that had destroyed Opal's life, and their willingness to share space with him was courtesy to her wishes rather than forgiveness for his failures. Opal's mother arrived last, a woman named Garnet who carried herself with the kind of dignity that came from surviving multiple impossible situations and refusing to let them break her. She looked at Ian once, really looked, seeing past the expensive clothes and the exhaustion and the desperate need for absolution he knew he didn't deserve. My daughter loved you. Garnet's voice carried the low timbre of someone who'd learned to project authority without raising volume. Loved you enough to forgive you before you even knew you needed forgiveness. Loved you enough to keep your children safe even when you didn't deserve that protection. That kind of grace is rare enough that you'd better spend the rest of your life earning it. Because if you waste what she gave you, if you let those girls grow up without understanding the sacrifice she made, I'll make your family's cruelty look gentle by comparison. The threat wasn't empty. and Ian recognized it as the particular promise of a mother who'd watched her daughter suffer and die because someone else's family had decided she didn't matter. "I won't waste it. I swear to you, I'll make sure they know exactly how much she loved them, how hard she fought to give them life, how their existence is proof that something good can come from terrible circumstances." Garnet studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly, accepting his vow while making it clear she'd be watching to ensure he kept it. "Then we understand each other. Now go sit with her while she's still conscious enough to know you're there, because time is running out faster than any of us want to acknowledge." Ian returned to Opal's ICU room, settling into the chair that had become his post, taking her hand again, even though she probably couldn't feel it anymore. He talked to her about the twins, about how Jane had smiled that morning in a way that seemed almost intentional, about how Carly had finally slept for 3 consecutive hours, about all the small miracles that composed their daughters' brief lives. He told her about the apartment he was already looking at, something bigger with room for the girls to grow, in a neighborhood where Ruth had agreed to move to so they'd have continuity of care. He described the college fund he'd set up, the trust that would ensure they'd never lack resources, even if something happened to him. He made promises about therapy and cultural education, and making sure they knew their mother's family as well as they knew him. And when her breathing changed, when the machines started their final symphony of alarms, when the doctors came with their careful expressions to tell him there was nothing more they could do, Ian leaned close and whispered the only thing left that mattered. "Thank you for saving them. Thank you for being strong enough to make the choice I couldn't have made. Thank you for loving me even when I didn't deserve it, and for giving me these last weeks to learn who you really were behind all my family's lies. I'll make sure they know you, really know you, not just as the mother who died, but as the woman who lived fiercely enough to give them a future." Opal's eyes flickered open one last time, focusing on his face with effort that cost her everything remaining. Her lips moved, shaping words he couldn't hear but could read in the deliberate motion. "Love them." And then she was gone, and the machines flatlined, and the medical staff moved with practiced efficiency to document the time and turn off equipment that no longer served any purpose. Ian sat holding her hand long after it went cold, long after Indigo came to gently suggest he should go check on the twins, long after the rational part of his brain understood that staying wouldn't bring her back. Finally, Garnet entered the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's not here anymore. She left hours ago, and what you're holding is just the shell she used to wear. Go take care of her daughters. That's how you honor her now, by doing what she spent her last months teaching you to do." Ian stood on legs that felt uncertain beneath him, released Opal's hand with the particular grief of letting go of something precious, knowing it was the last time, and walked out of the hospital into the dawn of a world where Opal Winter no longer existed except in memory and in the 2 tiny humans, who carried her features and her strength, and her refusal to surrender to circumstances that should have broken her. Chapter 6. The Inheritance. The apartment felt haunted in ways that had nothing to do with supernatural belief and everything to do with the particular absence of someone who'd filled every corner with their presence. Ian moved through rooms where Opal had sat, stood, held their daughters, recorded videos that he still couldn't bring himself to watch, and felt her missingness like a physical pressure against his chest that made breathing require conscious effort. The twins sensed something had shifted in their universe, crying more frequently, sleeping less deeply, rejecting comfort in ways that suggested they understood on some pre-verbal level that the person who'd carried them for months no longer existed to hold them. Jane developed a rash that the pediatrician couldn't explain, and Kaylee stopped eating properly, taking bottles with the reluctance of someone who'd decided participation in life required more effort than she was willing to expend. Ruth appeared every morning without being asked, taking over when Ian's hands shook too badly to hold bottles steady, cleaning when he forgot that dishes needed washing and laundry needed folding. She never offered platitudes about time healing wounds or everything happening for a reason, just presence and practical help and the occasional sharp observation that he needed to eat something before he collapsed. You can't parent from grief this consuming. Ruth spoke while preparing formula, her movements efficient from decades of raising children and grandchildren. You can grieve and parent simultaneously, but not if you let the grief become more important than their immediate needs. Opal wouldn't want you falling apart. She'd want you learning how to function broken. The words were harsh enough that Ian might have been offended if they weren't also completely accurate. He'd been moving through his days in a fog of loss, going through the motions of infant care while his mind replayed every conversation with Opal, every moment he'd missed by believing his family's lies, every choice that had led to this particular configuration of tragedy. Indigo called daily, checking on the twins and on Ian's mental state with the persistence of someone who understood that grief could be dangerous if left unmonitored. She'd taken charge of funeral arrangements, handling details that Ian couldn't focus on without his mind fragmenting into pieces that didn't quite fit back together properly. The service is scheduled for Saturday. Indigo's voice came through the phone with careful neutrality. Small gathering, family only, the kind of intimate goodbye Opal wanted, rather than some massive production. You're invited if you feel capable of being there, but no one will judge you if you need to stay with the girls instead. Ian wanted to attend, wanted to be present for the final goodbye, wanted to prove he could honor Opal properly, even though he'd failed her in almost every other way. But the twins were barely managing without him disappearing for hours, and the thought of leaving them with anyone, even Ruth, made his chest tighten with anxiety that bordered on panic. "I'll try to make it." The words came out uncertain, acknowledging limitations he was still learning to navigate. "Can we do a video call if I can't be there in person? I need to hear what people say about her, need to know how she was remembered by people who loved her longer than I did." "Of course." Indigo's tone softened slightly, recognizing the particular torture of loving someone after they were gone and having no way to make that love matter anymore. "I'll set it up so you can watch the whole service, hear all the stories, understand who she was to people who knew her before you existed." The funeral happened on a grey Saturday that matched Ian's internal weather, and he watched from Opal's apartment while holding Jane and sitting near Kaylee's bassinet, bearing witness through a screen to the celebration of a life he'd only understood in its final months. Person after person stood to share memories that painted Opal as brilliant and fierce and generous and funny, someone who'd lifted up everyone around her, who'd fought for justice in small ways that accumulated into significance, who'd loved completely even when that love wasn't returned with equivalent intensity. Her college roommate described how Opal had talked her down from dropping out during a particularly brutal semester, had shared her meal plan when money got tight, had celebrated every small victory like it was a major triumph. A former colleague explained how Opal had mentored junior staff with patience and genuine investment in their success, how she'd pushed back against discrimination so quietly that people didn't realize they'd been challenged until after they'd changed their behavior. Indigo spoke last, her voice breaking as she described watching her younger sister sacrifice herself for children she'd never get to raise, making the hardest choice imaginable with grace that Indigo still couldn't fully comprehend. Ian watched it all through tears that wouldn't stop, holding his daughters close, understanding with devastating clarity that Opal had been a complete person with a full life before he'd entered it, that his family hadn't just destroyed his relationship with her, they'd ended a life that had meaning and purpose and connections that extended far beyond anything related to him. The video calls from Opal's extended family started that evening and continued daily. People wanting to see the twins, wanting to verify that Ian was managing, wanting to maintain connection to the children who were their last link to Opal. He fielded questions from cousins whose names he couldn't keep straight, from aunts who offered advice about everything from colic to sleep training, to managing his own grief while caring for newborns. Garnet visited weekly, arriving with food Ian forgot to eat and practical help that never felt like judgment, even though he knew he was barely keeping his head above water. She taught him songs Opal had loved as a child, explained family traditions that the twins should understand, even if they'd never participate in them directly, told stories that built a picture of her daughter as someone who'd always been fighting for something, whether it was justice or recognition or just the right to exist without being diminished. "You need to watch the videos." Garnet spoke without preamble one afternoon, gesturing to the boxes under Opal's bed that Ian had been avoiding, like they contained explosives. You need to see what she recorded for them, understand the legacy she was trying to create. Stop treating her final gifts like they're too painful to acknowledge. Ian's hands shook as he pulled out the first box, labeled Birth to Age 5 in Opal's precise handwriting. Inside were dozens of videos organized by milestone and occasion, each one representing hours of effort when she could barely stay conscious, when every moment spent recording meant less rest and faster deterioration. He started with the video labeled For Their First Christmas and pressed play, watching Opal's face fill the screen, her smile warm, despite the obvious pain medication couldn't quite mask. "Hi, babies. It's Christmas, and you're probably wondering why there's this strange woman talking to you from a screen. I'm your mom, and I'm recording this because I won't be there in person to see you open presents, or wear matching pajamas, or do all the things that make holidays magical when you're small." Her voice continued, telling stories about Christmas traditions in her family, describing decorations her mother made by hand every year, sharing recipes that had been passed down through generations. She talked about the importance of generosity and gratitude, about making sure people felt seen during a season that could be lonely for those without family support, but finding joy in small moments rather than expensive displays. Ian watched video after video, moving through milestones chronologically, seeing Opal address her daughters at every age, anticipating questions they might have, and providing answers she wouldn't be alive to give in person. She talked about puberty and dating and career choices and heartbreak and marriage and parenthood, offering wisdom and perspective and the particular understanding that came from having lived through her own version of those experiences. The video labeled When They Ask Why I'm Not There was the hardest to watch, and Ian almost skipped it before realizing that avoiding hard things was what had gotten him into this situation in the first place. Opal's face on the screen looked directly at the camera, speaking with the fierce intensity of someone determined to be understood correctly. "You're probably old enough now to understand that I died when you were babies. And you're probably wondering why I made the choice I made, why I didn't try harder to survive, whether you were worth the sacrifice. So let me be very clear about something. You were worth it. Every moment of pain, every month of knowing I was dying, every choice I made to prioritize your survival over my treatment was worth it, because you exist, and that existence is a miracle I got to witness, even if only briefly." She paused, and Ian could see her gathering strength for what came next. "Your father's family tried to erase me from the world because they decided I wasn't good enough to be part of their legacy. They hurt me in ways that directly contributed to my death, and I want you to understand that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond their intentions. But I also want you to understand that their cruelty doesn't define your worth, that you carry my blood and my strength and my refusal to surrender, and that combination makes you powerful enough to overcome anything they might try to inflict." The video continued with Opal explaining her diagnosis, her treatment options, the choice she'd made, and why she'd made it. building a narrative that would help her daughters understand they were chosen rather than feeling responsible for her death. She spoke with the careful clarity of someone who'd thought deeply about how to communicate complicated truths to children who weren't ready to hear them but would need to eventually. Ian spent 3 days watching all the videos, learning who Opal had been through her own words rather than through the fractured lens of other people's memories. He saw her fierce advocacy for justice, her capacity for joy, even when circumstances were terrible, her absolute conviction that her daughters deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt. And he understood with crushing weight that his job now was to be the parent she would have been if his family hadn't killed her. The letter arrived from his father's attorney on a Tuesday. Formal legal language requesting visitation rights for paternal grandparents, citing precedent and family law and the importance of children knowing their extended family. Ian read it once before feeding it into the shredder, understanding that this was exactly what Opal had predicted. His mother trying to manipulate her way back into their lives through legal pressure and social expectation. He called the attorney Opal had used to draft her final directives, a woman named Phoenix who specialized in protecting children from family members who posed emotional or psychological harm. She reviewed the letter, reviewed the video evidence of his mother's actions, and drafted a response that made it clear any attempt to gain access to the twins would result in criminal complaints and public release of evidence that would destroy the Jameson family reputation completely. They'll probably back down. Phoenix's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd fought these battles before and knew how to win them. Most people who operate through manipulation and control can't handle having their tactics exposed to scrutiny. Once they understand that fighting will cost them more than surrendering, they'll retreat and look for easier targets. But Ian knew his mother better than Phoenix did, understood that she didn't retreat so much as regroup and attack from different angles. This wouldn't be the last attempt to access his daughters, just the first in what would probably be a lifelong battle to keep them safe from people who shared their DNA but didn't deserve their trust. He returned to the videos that evening, watching Opal address the specific scenario of his family trying to gain access, her instructions clear and unambiguous. Don't let guilt or social pressure make you compromise their safety. Don't let anyone convince you that forgiveness requires access. Your mother killed me, slowly and deliberately, and that fact doesn't change just because time passes or because maintaining the grudge feels exhausting. Protect them the way I can't anymore, and know that I'm grateful even if I can't tell you so directly. Ian made a promise to the screen, to Opal's recorded image, to his own daughters sleeping nearby. He would protect them from his family's toxicity with the same fierceness Opal had shown in choosing their lives over her own. He would teach them about their mother with honesty and pride, rather than treating her death as something shameful to hide. He would become the father she'd trusted him to be, even though every day felt like drowning in responsibilities he barely understood. And he would make sure that when Jane and Kaylee were old enough to ask questions about why their grandmother never visited, why their uncle never sent birthday presents, why half their genetic family was absent from their lives, they would understand that some absences were protection rather than punishment. That love sometimes meant keeping dangerous people at a distance, even when that distance looked cruel to outsiders who didn't know the full story. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. Ian's attorney team assembled in a conference room that smelled like expensive leather and carefully controlled temperature, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who enjoyed destruction when it was legally sanctioned. They'd spent 6 weeks building cases against his mother, his brother, and everyone who'd participated in Opal's systematic erasure, compiling evidence that painted a picture of conspiracy so extensive it required charts to track all the moving pieces. The criminal complaints are ready to file. The lead attorney, a woman named Sterling who'd built her career on representing domestic abuse survivors, spread documents across the table like she was laying out cards for a particularly satisfying hand. We have drug facilitation, fraud, identity theft, criminal conspiracy, and depending on how aggressive we want to be, we could potentially argue something approaching manslaughter. Given that the stress and homelessness your family caused directly contributed to Opal's delayed diagnosis. Ian studied the paperwork with the detachment of someone who'd already made peace with burning down everything his family had built. File all of it. I want criminal charges, civil suits, complaints with every professional organization they're part of, press releases that make it impossible for them to claim ignorance or misunderstanding. I want their names to become synonymous with the kind of calculated cruelty that destroys innocent women. Sterling nodded approvingly, recognizing the particular resolve of someone who'd moved past anger into cold strategic planning. Your father has been trying to reach you through multiple channels. His attorney has sent 14 requests for a meeting, all of which we've declined per your instructions. But you should know he's filed for divorce and is cooperating with our investigation, providing documentation that corroborates much of what we already knew. He's trying to save himself by throwing Mother under the bus. Ian felt no satisfaction in his father's belated attempt at accountability, just exhaustion at the predictability of people choosing self-preservation over genuine remorse. Let him cooperate. Let him provide evidence, but make it clear that helping now doesn't erase his complicity then. Doesn't mean I'll ever speak to him again. Doesn't earn him access to his grandchildren, no matter how reformed he claims to be. The following weeks moved with the grinding inevitability of legal machinery once it started. Motions filed and responded to, evidence submitted and contested. News stories breaking about the Jameson family's dark secrets, despite their expensive PR team's best efforts at damage control. Ian's mother fought every accusation with the fury of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation, hiring attorneys who specialized in making victims look like opportunists, leaking counter-narratives that painted Opal as unstable and Ian as manipulated by a dying woman's lies. But Sterling had anticipated these tactics, had prepared responses that systematically dismantled each false claim, that presented the video evidence in ways that made denial impossible. The footage of his mother and brother planning Opal's destruction went viral despite their attempts to suppress it, shared across social media platforms by people horrified that this kind of calculated cruelty existed among families who appeared perfect from outside. Ian watched his family's empire crumble from his apartment, feeding twins and changing diapers and managing infant illnesses while his phone exploded with messages from people who wanted statements or apologies or confirmation that the Jameson heir had really turned against his own mother. He ignored most of them, responding only to direct questions from Sterling about legal strategy or from journalists who seemed genuinely interested in justice rather than just scandal. His brother attempted suicide badly, a cry for help that resulted in hospitalization and mandatory psychiatric evaluation rather than actual death. Ian received the notification from his father with the emotional detachment of someone hearing about a stranger's misfortune, unable to summon sympathy for someone who drugged an unconscious woman and then played victim when consequences finally arrived. He's claiming diminished capacity, arguing that Mother manipulated him into actions he wouldn't have taken. Independently, Sterling's voice carried the particular disdain of someone who'd heard every excuse human beings invented to avoid accountability. The psychiatric evaluation will determine whether that holds legal weight, but regardless, he's facing significant prison time once the criminal trial concludes. Good. Ian adjusted Jane in his arms, supporting her head the way Opal had taught him, hyper-aware of every small movement that could indicate distress or discomfort. Let him understand what it feels like to have autonomy stripped away, to be trapped in circumstances you can't control. to experience the kind of powerlessness he inflicted on someone who'd done nothing to deserve it. The civil suits moved slower than criminal charges, but with the same inexorable momentum. Lawyers dissecting every financial transaction that had contributed to Opal's destruction, freezing assets and placing liens and making it impossible for his mother to access the wealth she'd spent decades accumulating. She fought like someone whose entire identity was wrapped up in money and status, hiring investigators to dig into Ian's life and Opal's past, looking for anything that would undermine their credibility or shift the narrative back toward her victimization. They found nothing useful, just the expected complexity of real human lives, relationship history and youthful mistakes, and all the normal messiness that everyone accumulated through years of existing. Opal's background check came back exactly as she'd always presented it. Scholarship student who'd worked multiple jobs to support herself through university. Talented designer who'd earned every promotion through merit rather than connections. Person who'd been systematically destroyed by people with more power and fewer scruples. The company his grandfather had built fractured along predictable lines. Board members choosing sides based on self-interest rather than principle. Executives jumping ship before the scandal contaminated their own reputations. Ian resigned from his position formally, issuing a statement that made clear he was stepping away, not because of weakness, but because his daughters needed him more than any company ever would. Because Opal had taught him that legacy was measured in how you treated vulnerable people, rather than in profit margins and architectural landmarks. His mother's deposition was scheduled for a Thursday, and Sterling called Ian that evening with barely contained satisfaction. She admitted to approximately 60% of what we accused her of, tried to justify the rest as protective mothering, and managed to sound so profoundly convinced of her own righteousness that even her own attorney looked disturbed. The video will be useful for trial, and her complete lack of remorse will make the jury's decision very easy. Ian felt nothing resembling satisfaction, just bone-deep weariness that came from understanding his family's capacity for harm extended deeper than he'd initially comprehended. What about the charges related to Opal's death? Can we make manslaughter stick, given how indirect the causation is? It's borderline, but we're going to try. Sterling's voice carried the particular determination of someone who'd seen too many perpetrators escape consequences through legal technicalities. We have medical experts who'll testify about how stress impacts cancer outcomes, how homelessness delays diagnosis, how the choice Opal faced between treatment and pregnancy was directly caused by your mother's actions. It's not guaranteed, but juries respond to emotional truth even when legal proof is complicated. The trial began in autumn. Courthouse steps crowded with protesters holding signs that ranged from supportive to hostile, media trucks blocking traffic, the particular circus atmosphere that accompanied cases where wealth and family drama intersected with serious criminal charges. Ian attended every day of testimony, despite Sterling's advice that it might be more emotionally manageable to follow through summaries, bringing Ruth and the twins when possible, making sure the jury saw the faces of the children whose mother had been destroyed. Witness after witness detailed the systematic nature of his family's conspiracy. The purchased police reports and manufactured evidence and threats designed to ensure Opal's silence. Medical professionals explained her diagnosis, her treatment options, the choice she'd faced, and why delaying care for months had transformed a potentially treatable cancer into a death sentence. Opal's family testified about watching her deteriorate, about the voice messages where she'd described her fear and isolation, about the final months where she'd focused entirely on preparing her daughters for a life without her. Ian took the stand on the trial's third week, answering questions about the video evidence, about discovering the truth, about the weeks he'd spent learning to be a father while watching the woman he'd loved die from choices his family had forced her to make. He kept his voice steady despite wanting to scream, kept his answers factual, despite the rage that lived in his chest like a separate organism. Made sure the jury understood that this wasn't about a relationship gone wrong, but about deliberate destruction of someone who'd never had the power to fight back effectively. His mother's defense was predictably focused on minimizing her role, arguing that she'd acted with good intentions that had accidentally resulted in harm, that she couldn't have predicted Opal would get pregnant or sick, that holding her responsible for such indirect consequences stretched causation beyond reasonable limits. Her attorney painted her as a concerned mother trying to protect her son from a gold digger who'd manipulated him with pregnancy and terminal illness, as someone who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve criminal conviction for parental overreach. The closing arguments came on a Friday, Sterling speaking with the controlled fury of someone channeling decades of witnessing powerful people escape accountability for harming vulnerable victims. She held up photographs of Opal, healthy and laughing in the months before the Jameson family entered her life, then contrasted them with hospital images from her final weeks. The visual evidence of systematic destruction more powerful than any words could capture. The defense wants you to believe this was an accident, a tragic coincidence, unfortunate circumstances that no one could have predicted. Sterling's voice filled the courtroom with the particular resonance of someone who knew how to command attention. But accidents don't require burner phones and stage photographs. Coincidences don't involve manufactured criminal records and threatened child removals. What happened to Opal Winter was deliberate, calculated, and executed with the kind of cold precision that should terrify every person in this room who's ever been vulnerable to someone with more power and fewer scruples. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and Ian spent that time in the apartment with his daughters, trying not to obsess over outcomes he couldn't control, trying to focus on the immediate needs of babies who didn't care about trials or justice or any of the adult complications that governed his life. Jane had started rolling over, a milestone Opal would never witness, and Kaylee had developed a habit of gripping his finger with surprising strength, like she was afraid he'd disappear if she didn't hold on tight enough. The verdict came through on a Tuesday afternoon. Guilty on most counts, hung jury on the manslaughter charges. Sentencing scheduled for the following month. Ian received the news while heating bottles, and he felt relief mixed with the hollow understanding that no legal outcome would bring Opal back, would give his daughters their mother, would undo any of the damage his family had inflicted. Sterling called minutes later, her voice carrying satisfaction tempered by professional recognition that this was a beginning rather than an ending. Your mother is looking at significant prison time, probably 7 to 12 years, depending on how the judge weighs the evidence. Your brother pleaded out and will serve 4 years minimum. The civil judgments are in your favor across the board, and their assets are being liquidated to cover damages and restitution. You won as much as anyone can win in situations like this. I didn't win. Ian's voice came out flat, drained of emotion that would require energy he didn't have available. I proved my family destroyed an innocent woman, but that proof doesn't resurrect her. It doesn't give Jane and Kaylee their mother back. It doesn't change the fact that I was complicit through my blindness and my willingness to believe the worst about someone I claimed to love. No, but it prevents them from ever doing this to anyone else. Sterling's tone gentled slightly, acknowledging the particular grief of winning battles that couldn't fix the fundamental problem. And it gives your daughters a different story than they would have had otherwise, one where their mother's death was acknowledged as wrong rather than treated as inevitable or deserved. That matters, even if it doesn't feel like enough right now. Ian ended the call and returned to his daughters, who'd started crying in that synchronized way they'd developed, like they were operating on shared nervous systems. He picked them both up, with the competence that came from months of practice, settling them against his chest, feeling their bodies relax as they recognized his heartbeat and warmth and the particular safety his presence had come to represent. "Your mother would have been proud of you both," he spoke aloud, even though they couldn't understand words yet, building the habit of talking to them about Opal in present tense, rather than treating her like a secret to hide. She would have celebrated these milestones, would have recorded them for posterity, would have made sure you knew how special every small achievement was. And since she can't do that herself, I'm going to do it for her. Going to tell you stories about her until you feel like you know her, even though you'll never get to meet her in person. The sentencing hearing happened on a cold morning with snow threatening, and Ian attended alone, leaving the twins with Ruth, needing to witness his mother face consequences without the emotional complication of managing infant needs simultaneously. She looked diminished in her prison jumpsuit, all the wealth and social status stripped away to reveal someone who'd built her entire identity on appearances that no longer mattered once legal accountability arrived. The judge spoke with the particular gravity of someone who understood this case represented something larger than individual charges, something about how society treated vulnerable women and whether powerful families could destroy people with impunity. The sentence was harsh, but not as severe as the maximum allowed, acknowledging that while his mother's actions were calculated and harmful, they hadn't involved physical violence and had been motivated by maternal concern, however misguided that concern had been. Ian felt nothing as his mother was led away, no satisfaction or grief or closure, just the empty recognition that consequences had finally caught up with someone who'd spent decades evading them. He left the courthouse through a side entrance to avoid media, drove home through snow that had started falling, and found his daughters awake and fussy, needing the kind of immediate physical care that didn't allow space for philosophical reflection about justice and accountability. Chapter 8. The Goodbye. The hospital bed had been delivered on a Tuesday and assembled in Opal's bedroom, where sunlight used to wake her gently. Through windows she'd hung curtains in herself. Hospice workers moved through the apartment with practiced quiet, setting up equipment that beeped and hummed and monitored the slow shutdown of systems that had been failing for months. "I want to hold them one more time." Her voice came out thinner than it had been even the previous week, reduced to whispers by lungs that no longer processed oxygen efficiently. "Really hold them, not just have them lie beside me." Ian lifted Jane from her bassinet with movements that had become instinctive and placed her in Opal's arms, adjusting pillows to bear most of the weight, hovering close enough to catch her if Opal's strength failed completely. "She's gotten so big." Opal's fingers traced Jane's face with the gentleness of someone touching something precious and fragile. "She looks more like you every day. Same stubborn chin. She's going to be formidable, this one. I already have my hands full." Ian managed a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "They're conspiring against my sleep schedule with coordinated wake-up calls every 2 hours. Good. Keep you sharp. Keep you from falling into complacency." Opal shifted Jane slightly, finding a position that didn't aggravate the pain medication couldn't fully suppress. "Complacency is what let your family destroy me in the first place. If you'd questioned their narrative instead of accepting it, everything would have been different." The accusation was gentle but absolute, and Ian couldn't dispute it because she was right. "I'm sorry." The apology felt inadequate, as always. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to question them. I'm sorry you're dying because I was too weak to see what they were doing. Being sorry doesn't help me, but maybe it'll help you become someone better for them." Opal gestured toward Kaylee with her chin. "I need both of them here, need to say things while I still can." Ian arranged both twins in the bed, building a nest of pillows that would keep them secure. Jane made small, contented sounds against her mother's chest, and Kaylee gripped Opal's hospital gown with tiny fists. "My beautiful girls." Opal's voice cracked, tears sliding down her face. I'm so sorry I won't be there to see you grow up, won't get to braid your hair, or teach you to drive, or help you navigate heartbreak. But I need you to understand something when you're old enough to comprehend it. You didn't kill me. The cancer killed me, and the circumstances that delayed my treatment killed me, and your father's family's cruelty killed me. But you two saved me in ways that matter more than physical survival. You gave me purpose when I'd lost everything else. Ian watched his daughters respond to their mother's voice, both of them demonstrating the particular trust that infants had for primary caregivers. They would never remember this moment consciously, would never have their own memories of their mother beyond what others told them, and that loss felt like theft of something precious. There are things I need you to promise me. Opal shifted her attention to Ian, her gaze carrying the intensity of someone trying to compress lifetimes of instruction into whatever time remained. Real promises, not just the comfortable lies people tell dying women. Anything. First, therapy. Real therapy with someone who specializes in grief and family trauma. Opal's voice carried authority. You're carrying guilt and rage and loss that will poison you if you don't process it properly. And they need you healthy more than they need you martyring yourself. Ian nodded. Second, don't you dare make them responsible for your happiness. Don't use them as emotional support animals who have to manage your grief. Don't tell them things like, "You're all I have now," that make them feel guilty for growing up and having their own lives. I won't. Third, and this is the one I'm most worried about. Opal's fingers traced patterns on Jane's back. Fall in love again. Find someone who can be an actual partner, who can help you raise them, who can give them the kind of maternal presence I can't provide. Don't spend the next 18 years frozen in grief. I can't promise that. Ian's voice came out strangled. I can't imagine wanting anyone else. Can't imagine trusting someone enough to let them near the girls. You wouldn't be erasing me. You'd be building on the foundation I laid. Opal met his eyes with fierce determination. I want them to have a mother figure who can braid hair and explain periods and all the things that fathers just can't do as well. I want you to have a partner who shares the burden. And I want all of you to be happy, really happy, not just surviving but thriving. Indigo appeared in the doorway carrying containers of food. Your mother is on her way. She wanted to be here for the end. Good. She should be here. Opal's voice carried satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. Can you take the girls for a bit? I need to talk to Ian alone. Indigo lifted the twins with practiced competence, settling them in their bassinets nearby, giving the illusion of privacy as she left. I'm terrified. Opal's words came out so quietly, Ian almost missed them. I'm terrified of the actual dying, of leaving them with just you when I've spent months teaching you how to be adequate, but knowing adequate might not be enough. I'm terrified too. Ian took her hand, feeling how cold her fingers had become. I'm terrified I'll forget something important you taught me, terrified they'll hate me someday for not being you. You'll make mistakes. Opal squeezed his fingers weakly. You'll mess up in small ways, and occasionally in big ways. But you'll also show up every day, put their needs before your own convenience, love them fiercely enough that they feel secure. That's actually everything that matters. The morphine pump clicked, and Ian watched Opal's face relax slightly as the medication took effect. Tell them I loved them. The words came out slurred. Tell them every day. Make it part of their bedtime routine. Make sure they understand that dying doesn't mean I stopped loving them. I will. Ian leaned close, his forehead resting against hers. I'll tell them stories about you until they're sick of hearing them. I'll make sure they understand you chose them deliberately, that their existence is proof love is stronger than the cruelty that tried to prevent them from being born. Garnet arrived an hour later, settling into the chair beside Opal's bed, taking her daughter's other hand, completing a circuit of love. I'm proud of you. Baby, Garnet's voice carried strength. You fought harder than anyone should have to fight, protected your babies with everything you had. That's what good mothers do. Opal's eyes opened briefly, focusing on her mother's face with visible effort. Take care of them. Make sure Ian doesn't isolate himself. Make sure the girls know they're part of your family. I promise. Garnet pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. The dying happened gradually and then suddenly, Opal's breathing changing from labored to shallow to those final rattling breaths. Ian held one hand, Garnet held the other, and Indigo stood at the foot of the bed, with her hand resting on her sister's leg. Love them. Opal's final words were barely audible. Just love them and everything else will follow. And then she was gone. The monitors flatlined. The stillness that followed more profound than any sound Ian had ever heard. Garnet wept quietly, but her hand stayed steady on her daughter's. Indigo made phone calls, handled logistics because someone had to, and Ian clearly couldn't function. The twins woke crying, demanding food and attention. Ian stood mechanically, lifted Jane from her bassinet, prepared a bottle with movements that had become automatic. He fed his daughter while standing over the hospital bed where Opal's body still lay, making good on the promise to prioritize their needs, even when his own grief was trying to swallow him whole. She'd be proud of you right now. Garnet spoke from across the room. She'd be proud that you're showing up for them even when you want to fall apart. The hospice workers removed Opal's body an hour later, and the bedroom felt emptier than it had any right to feel. Ian couldn't bring himself to sleep in there, so he moved both bassinets to the living room and slept on the couch for weeks afterward. Chapter 9. The Final Teaching. The days after Opal's death blurred together, measured only by feeding schedules and diaper changes. Ian moved through routines on autopilot, his body performing necessary tasks while his mind existed somewhere else. Ruth appeared daily without being asked, taking over when Ian's hands shook too badly to hold bottles. She strong-armed him into calling a therapist, a woman named Valencia who specialized in traumatic grief and single parenting. You're not managing fine. Valencia spoke during their first session while Ian held Kaylee. You're surviving moment to moment, which is appropriate for someone 3 weeks out from losing their partner while caring for newborns. But surviving isn't the same as healing. Ian found himself talking about things he'd been avoiding: the guilt, the rage at his family, the terror that he'd fail his daughters, the loneliness of being the only parent who showed up while knowing he'd never be enough to replace what they'd lost. Opal told me I needed to fall in love again. The words came out like confession, but even thinking about that feels like betrayal. Valencia leaned forward. What do you think Opal meant? Do you think she was asking you to replace her, or was she asking you to build a life full enough that her daughters wouldn't grow up in a house haunted by her absence? The sessions became weekly lifelines. He learned techniques for managing intrusive thoughts, for sitting with difficult emotions without letting them derail his functionality. Garnet visited regularly, bringing meals and teaching him how to do Jane's hair, explaining the importance of oil and gentle detangling. She showed him which products to use on Carly's sensitive skin. You're doing better than I expected. Garnet demonstrated how to section Jane's hair for twists. You're showing up every day, learning what you don't know, asking for help. That's more than most people manage. The twins were changing rapidly, hitting milestones early. Jane smiled deliberately now, recognizing faces. Carly was trying to roll over, learning coordination. Ian recorded everything obsessively, building an archive his daughters could someday review. He narrated these recordings with stories about Opal. Your mother would have loved seeing this. She would have picked you up and danced around the apartment, celebrating like you'd won an Olympic medal. Indigo called weekly, maintaining the connection Opal had insisted was crucial. She sent care packages with items chosen specifically for black children, dolls with their skin tone, books featuring characters who looked like them. Have you thought about what you're going to tell them when they're old enough to ask questions? Indigo's voice carried concern. About their mother, about your family. I'm going to tell them the truth, adjusted for age appropriateness. Ian had drafted and discarded countless explanations. That their mother loved them enough to die for them. That my family hurt her badly enough that I had to cut contact to protect them. The first major boundary test came when Ian's father's attorney sent another letter requesting grandparent visitation. Sterling reviewed it with barely concealed disdain. They're going to keep trying until we make it so costly that persistence isn't worth the effort. Sterling's voice carried strategic calculation. I recommend we file a restraining order. The restraining order was granted quickly, the judge clearly disturbed by evidence of how Ian's mother had systematically destroyed Opal's life. His father made one final attempt at contact, sending a handwritten letter directly to Ian's apartment. The envelope sat unopened for 3 days before Ian finally read it, discovering pages of explanation and justification that managed to center his father's suffering while barely acknowledging Opal's death. Ian read it once before feeding it into the shredder. There would be no reconciliation. Some boundaries were permanent. Jane said her first word at 9 months, a garbled dada that made Ian cry with joy and sorrow simultaneously. Carly followed 2 weeks later with what sounded suspiciously like "no," and Ian recorded both moments obsessively. Your mother would have thrown a party, Ian spoke to his daughters while they played on the floor. She would have invited everyone we knew, made elaborate food, treated your first words like they were Nobel Prize acceptance speeches. Ian studied Opal's videos and letters like sacred texts, learning who she'd been before he met her. He watched her college graduation video. He read her journal from the year before they met, and slowly, painfully, he began building a version of himself that could honor her memory while still moving forward, that could parent effectively while still processing grief. Garnet watched his progress with a critical eye. You're doing the work, which is more than most people manage. But don't think finishing therapy means you're done processing this. Grief is lifelong, it just changes shape over time. I know. Ian adjusted Kaylee's outfit. I'm not trying to get over Opal or move past what happened. I'm just trying to build a life where her death doesn't define everything. That's exactly the right approach. Garnet's approval carried weight. Height. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep showing up even when it's hard. That's how you honor what she gave them. The challenge felt enormous and ongoing. But Ian was learning that parenthood was always like that. Nobody ever felt fully prepared. The best anyone could do was show up consistently, love fiercely, admit mistakes quickly, and trust that children were resilient enough to survive their parents' inevitable failures, as long as those failures came from trying rather than from indifference. Chapter 10. The Beginning After the End. Opal had been gone for 2 years when Ian met Soleil at a community garden where he'd started taking the twins to teach them about growing things, about patience and nurture, and the particular satisfaction of eating vegetables you'd planted yourself. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil, explaining something about companion planting to a group of children who hung on her every word like she was revealing the secrets of the universe. He noticed her first because Jane pointed, her tiny finger aimed at the woman with the brightest smile Ian had seen since Opal died, her voice carrying across the garden with the particular musicality of someone who loved teaching. Soleil worked in urban planning, focusing on food access in underserved neighborhoods, building systems that connected people to nutrition in ways that respected community knowledge rather than imposing external solutions. They started talking because Kaylee had an epic meltdown over getting dirt on her hands, and Soleil intervened with the competence of someone who understood sensory issues, offering wipes and patient redirection rather than judgment about parenting or child behavior. She treated his daughters like complete humans rather than tragic symbols, asking them questions and listening to their babbled responses like they were having real conversations. You're good with them. Ian spoke after Kaylee had calmed down. Watching Soleil show Jane how to patch soil around seedlings without crushing them. I like kids when they're allowed to be themselves instead of performing whatever adults expect. Soleil stood, brushing dirt from her jeans, her smile easy and uncomplicated. Too many people treat children like they're defective adults rather than humans at a different developmental stage who deserve respect appropriate to their capacity. They talked while the girls played, discovering shared interests in architecture and community development, in the ways cities could either nurture or destroy the people living in them. Soleil mentioned she'd seen his name on some controversial project years ago, something about affordable housing that had gotten killed by neighborhood opposition and wealthy developers. That project was important to someone I loved. Ian felt the familiar ache of mentioning Opal, testing whether this new person could handle his past without demanding he pretend it didn't exist. She died before we could see it through, but I'm still trying to figure out how to make it happen in her honor. I'm sorry for your loss. Soleil's condolence was simple and direct, not performative, not demanding details he wasn't ready to share. Loss like that changes your entire trajectory, doesn't it? Makes you question what matters, what's worth fighting for when everything feels temporary. They exchanged numbers, and Ian told himself it was just networking, just professional connection, nothing that resembled the terrifying vulnerability of romantic interest. But he found himself thinking about her between their sporadic coffee meetings, appreciating how she never pushed for more information than he was ready to give. How she treated his daughters with genuine interest, rather than just tolerating them to access him. Garnet noticed the shift in Ian's demeanor before he'd consciously acknowledged it himself. You met someone. I met a colleague who's working on similar urban development issues. Ian kept his voice carefully neutral, not quite lying, but not admitting the full truth either. You met someone who makes you smile differently than you have in 2 years. Garnet's correction was gentle, but absolute. Don't lie to me about it, and more importantly, don't lie to yourself about what you're feeling. Opal wanted this for you, explicitly asked you to build a life full enough that her daughters wouldn't grow up in a house haunted by absence. The permission to move forward felt simultaneously like relief and betrayal, like he was abandoning Opal by allowing himself to feel attraction to someone else. Valencia helped him work through the guilt in their sessions, pointing out that loving someone new didn't diminish what he'd felt for Opal, that human hearts had infinite capacity for connection when people were brave enough to stay open despite previous loss. Soleil and Ian's relationship developed slowly, over months of careful boundary setting and honest conversation about what each of them needed. She asked about Opal early, making it clear she wasn't interested in competing with a ghost, that she understood loving someone's memory while building present relationships weren't mutually exclusive if done with intention. I'm not trying to be their mother. Soleil spoke directly during a conversation about what their future might look like if they continued getting serious. They had a mother who loved them enough to die for them, and that's not something anyone can replace. But I can be an adult in their life who cares about them, who shows up consistently, who helps you carry the weight of raising them, because parenting shouldn't be solitary, even when circumstances make it feel that way. The proposal happened in Opal's old apartment. The space Ian had never been able to leave because it held too many memories of those final months. He'd kept it exactly as it was, a shrine to a woman who'd transformed from stranger to partner to ghost in the span of less than a year. Soleil had been patient with his inability to move forward literally, understanding that some grief required physical anchoring. This is probably unconventional. Ian knelt in the living room where Opal had held the twins, where she'd recorded videos, where she'd told him to fall in love again with someone who could help raise her daughters. But I need to do this here in this space. because I need her to be present for this decision, even though she's been gone for years." Soleil's eyes glistened with tears that suggested she understood the weight of what he was offering. The complexity of accepting a proposal that included honoring a dead woman's wishes while building something genuinely new. "I'll marry you, but only if you promise me we're building forward rather than backward. That we're creating something authentic rather than just fulfilling Opal's final instructions." "I promise." Ian slid the ring onto her finger, feeling simultaneously like he was keeping faith with Opal and betraying her. The particular emotional complexity of loving someone new while still mourning someone lost. "I promise we're building something real. Something that includes her memory without being defined by it. Something that gives Jane and Kaylee the full life she wanted for them." The girls were witnesses, old enough now to understand weddings as concepts, even if they couldn't fully grasp the significance. Jane had started asking questions about her mother, why she only existed in videos, why other kids had moms who picked them up from school, but she had Soleil instead. Ian answered honestly, age-appropriately, making sure she understood that Opal's absence wasn't abandonment, but forced separation. Kaylee asked fewer questions, but absorbed everything, processing silently in ways that worried Ian until Valencia assured him that some children coped through observation rather than verbalization. She'd started having nightmares about abandonment, waking up crying for people she couldn't consciously remember, but whose absence she felt viscerally. Indigo attended the wedding with cautious optimism, having spent months evaluating whether Soleil was genuinely committed or just performing commitment to secure access to Ian's resources. The judgment was rendered favorable after Soleil spent an entire holiday weekend with Opal's extended family, listening to stories and asking questions and making it clear she wanted Jane and Kaylee to understand their maternal heritage as something valuable rather than something to minimize. "You chose well." Indigo spoke to Ian during the reception, watching Soleil dance with the twins in a way that looked genuinely joyful rather than obligatory. "She's not trying to erase Opal or pretend she doesn't matter. She's making space for all of it, the past and the present and the future you're building together." That's what Opal would have wanted, someone who understood that loving her daughters meant honoring their mother's memory rather than competing with it. The years continued, measured in school years and lost teeth and the particular milestones that composed childhood. Jane became the peacemaker Ian had predicted, mediating conflicts between classmates, bringing home friends who needed extra support, demonstrating the particular emotional intelligence that came from having processed loss early. Kali remained fierce, challenging every rule, questioning every assumption, fighting for justice, even when fighting made her life harder. They asked harder questions as they grew older, wanting to understand not just that their mother had died, but why she died. What role their father's family had played in her destruction, why they never saw grandparents when other kids had them. Ian answered truthfully, showing them the videos Opal had recorded, explaining his family's actions without sugarcoating the cruelty, making sure they understood that blood relation didn't automatically deserve access or forgiveness. On their 10th birthday, Jane asked to visit Opal's grave alone, carrying journals her mother had written during pregnancy, needing private time to connect with someone she'd never consciously known, but whose absence had shaped her entire life. Ian watched his daughter walk toward the headstone with Opal's fierce determination in every step, carrying questions he couldn't answer, but trusting she'd find her own way to understanding. And in that moment of letting go, of watching Jane navigate grief in her own timeline, rather than his, Ian finally felt Opal's hand slip from his, not with the wrenching pain of fresh loss, but with the gentle release of someone who'd been holding on to make sure he could manage alone, who finally trusted he'd learned enough to honor her sacrifice without her constant supervision, who was satisfied he'd become the father their daughters needed, even though he'd started out being spectacularly inadequate for the task.